So far in the Theaetetus, we have seen a preliminary definition of knowledge where Theaetetus had first offered a definition of knowledge which was more akin to what Socrates called parts of knowledge, or we could think of examples of knowledge, like in the case of being a carpenter or doing geometry, things like that, right, which displays some kind of skill based on knowledge, but it doesn't tell us the essence of knowledge. And the first real definition Theaetetus gave is that knowledge is perception. Now, this definition was taken up using the philosophy of Protagoras and Heraclitus to try and justify and explain what does it mean that knowledge is perception. This was shown to be incoherent because it relied on epistemic relativism, right? And in that case, then, the claim that knowledge is perception can be equally invalid, right, or unsound to anyone else if they simply just disagree, right? It can be disputed, meaning that even for Protagoras himself, it has to be false if a majority of people disagree with Protagoras about that. It was also determined that knowledge simply being perception did not account for the true as something determinate and lasting, right? But instead, knowledge simply as perception was too much bound up in indeterminacy because of the nature of it becoming, right? And not being able to be identified as something essential to a thing, of which then can be taken up objectively. Now, this led Theaetetus to offer the second definition of knowledge we looked at, that knowledge is true opinion. And this seemed like a pretty good definition because, of course, whatever someone would have an opinion of would need to be, if it was knowledge, something true, right? It would have to actually correspond to the being of things, right? That I really know who Theaetetus is has to really correspond to the being of Theaetetus. The problem with this, though, besides the 5 different puzzles we looked at that were inadequate, is that it's clear that one can simply come across information and then therefore come to agree about the truth of something and yet not know why, not be able to explain it. It would be in the case of, as they talked about, the example of, say, in a courtroom where you could have someone who is, like the jury, that is persuaded by a lawyer that the person on trial is guilty, and it could be true that they're guilty, so the jury's opinion would be true, but they couldn't tell you why. They couldn't explain at all how they'd come to that opinion, why, it's the correct thing at all, right? And so there seems to be something lacking in this. Now, the third, and we saw, real quick, we saw as well how they briefly took up the process of learning, education, and how that was put aside, though. This is going to haunt the rest of the text, this putting aside of the case of education. But we'll see, though, there's still likely a point that is trying to be made in taking up these different cases or definitions of knowledge. We'll see at the end. Now, the third definition is an attempt to better work out the second one by saying, yes, it is still true opinion. It's not simply true opinion, but knowledge is true opinion with an articulation. So it is true opinion with logos, a justification, a way in which you can explain why that thing is what it is, how it's connected to other things. Right? What brings it into being? So Theaetetus says here, that's what I heard someone saying, Socrates, but forgot, but now it comes to me. He said that, whoever this person is, it's not entirely clear. He said that true opinion with an articulation is knowledge, but one that lacks articulation is beyond knowledge. It is something which is incomprehensible. It is, as we'll see, something which is it's ineffable. It is something which cannot be identified in speech. And so continuing, he says, and those things of which there is no articulation are not intelligible. He used just that name, but those that have one are intelligible, right? So we're seeing we need a rational account of whatever that opinion is, which is true. If one can give that rational account, if they can articulate why their opinion is true, then supposedly this is what knowledge is. So it's important to understand what is being translated here as articulation, the Greek word logos, because it is the logos which purports to be the thing that binds the perceptible and the intelligible, right? That which is not perceptible, which is the intelligible, the metaphysical. So it is logos then in the context of this dialogue as a whole, right? The role of this, which actually amounts to a return to a central question that was asked of Theaetetus earlier in the text, that they need to be looking for knowledge not simply in perception, but in that name, whatever it is, that the soul has when it occupies itself by itself with beings. So again, it's a return to the role of the soul. Now, Socrates follows up by saying, Theaetetus, you heard that argument from someone else. I too have heard something. And what Socrates then goes on to explain to try to justify the claim that knowledge is true opinion with an articulation has now become known as dream theory. So I'll read here Socrates' dream theory from 201e. Socrates says, "Then listen to a dream in return for a dream, since I in my turn seem to hear from some people that the primary things, something very much like elements, out of which we and everything else are composed, could have no articulation." Right? So the primary things which make up every possible thing are inarticulable. For each of them itself, by itself, could only be named. But it's out of one's power to apply any other description, not even that it is or isn't, since that would already be connecting being or not being with it, while one must not attach anything to it if one is going to speak about that thing itself alone. One ought not even to attach descriptions like itself, or that, or each, or alone, or this, or many other such things. For these things run around and get attached to everything, though they're different from the things they're connected with. It ought, if it were possible for it to be spoken of and have its own proper articulation, to be spoken of without all these other things. But as it is, it's impossible for any whatever of the primary things to be stated in an articulation. All right, and real quick, pausing here, we can think about why this would be the case according to this theory, that if there are basic building blocks, right, that make up all other things, you could not sufficiently, in its own totality, describe those very things, because you would be having to use language which are, right, compounds. They are things taken from other things that are already made possible by the very things you're trying to describe. So in some way, right, you're giving a deficient description of those elements. So he continues saying, there's nothing for it other than to be named only, since it is only a name, but the things made of these are already composite, and just as they are intertwined, so too, when their names are intertwined in the same way, there has come to be an articulation, since the very being of an articulation is an intertwining of names. So in that way, the elements are inarticulable, and compounds are knowable and speakable, and capable of being held in a true opinion. So whenever anyone gets hold of a true opinion without an articulation, his soul tells the truth about it without recognizing that, since anyone who doesn't have the power to give and accept an articulation is lacking knowledge about that thing. But once he also gets hold of articulation, a power over all these things has come to him, and a perfect condition has come to hold in him toward knowledge. So one then is said to have knowledge by having a true opinion with an articulation if they can give a description of that thing, if they can explain compounds such that, explaining the elements that make up those compounds. And they go on then to talk about this using syllables and names. So another way of this would be that knowledge of X, again, example again, Theaetetus, would mean true opinion with an articulation of the compound X or Theaetetus that analyzes it into what it's made up of, its simple elements. And so to form an opinion then of things that are perceived, like if I'm seeing Theaetetus off in the distance, that means the soul must make sense of them, right? So that process whereby all things in perception and then kind of grasping out of that the being of those things I am perceiving, right? The soul makes sense of all of that by articulating the elements into a compound which resembles then, right? It represents the being of that object X, in this case, Theaetetus, that I'm perceiving. Now, that means if Theaetetus is not composite, I can't actually know Theaetetus. I can only perceive Theaetetus because I cannot simply describe the elements themselves. Now they're going to give an example of this, and this turns into a critique. A dilemma results. And the dilemma works like this. A compound, like a syllable, is either A, no more than its elements, or its letters, in the case of in a word, or B, it is something over and above those elements. So if we take a syllable like so in Socrates, S-O, right? That compound S-O is either no more than its elements, which would be the letters S and O. So it is simply just S and O, right? And that's how I articulate the syllable so. Or it has to be something over and above those elements, an entirely distinct thing than those elements that make it up. And we'll see why this dilemma results, right? This is untenable. Now, if we look at alternative A, if I am to know then a syllable S-O in the name Socrates, and that syllable is no more than its elements, then it turns out I can't know the syllable so without also knowing its elements S and O. Right? We've already run into a problem that if I'm to articulate then that thing which is supposed to be a compound, so, the syllable so, in the name Socrates, which Socrates then is a compound of syllables and other letters, right? I need to articulate what makes up the syllable so. And to do that, I then need to explain what the elements are. And the only way I know what the elements are such that I can explain them is then to give an articulation of the individual elements or the letters S and O. But we had already said, right, elements are things which are inarticulable. So if I am to know the syllable so, I must know the elements S and O as well. But if S and O are unknowable, since they don't have elements to articulate them, I can't actually then know the compound syllable so either. So this argument that a compound is no more than its elements, those things which make it up, render it such that I can't even know that compound. Now let's look at alternative B. Right? So if we're to make sense of this dream theory, which is supposed to explain how it is that knowledge is true opinion with an articulation, we need to understand what it means to articulate something. And with alternative A, we see that it's untenable because to say that a syllable is no more than its elements ends up rendering the syllable or the compound itself inarticulable. So instead, maybe it's the case then that the syllable or compound is something over and above those elements. It is something distinct from those elements entirely, such that, as they say, the syllable is a single look that comes out of each and every letter when they're fitted together. It is that thing, then, that single look, which distinguishes it from the myriad background of other things in our experience or in our thoughts, such that then we can identify it and articulate that thing. Like when we come to learn a new language, we can pick out, right, words in that language, as where before they might have just seemed to run together. Now, this too, of course, has a problem. The syllable, if this were the case, that it is something over and above the elements that make it up, would not have the elements as the parts that make up the compound, because it would be something entirely different then. And if the elements are not parts of the syllable, then nothing else could be part of the syllable. What does that mean then? It becomes an element, because it has something which doesn't have building blocks making it up. That means the syllable itself would be inarticulable and therefore unknowable to the soul, as in the case of the elements. So in both alternative A and alternative B, we end up rendering the syllable or the compound things unintelligible. Now they put this aside, and instead they do focus on the role of speech, because if you remember earlier in the text, there was a likening of this process of learning or education as a kind of inner monologue of the soul to itself. So they give 3 attempts to understand logos, or articulation, what exactly that means. The first attempt, then, says that an articulation is simply speech or a statement. As Socrates says, the first would be making one's thinking apparent through sound, with phrases and words, right? Because this would be making things distinct. Molding one's opinion into the stream flowing through the mouth as if into a mirror or water, right? So it gives that reflection, that resemblance, the representation of that being which then you are articulating. This one, though, is quickly dismissed because anyone can give a speech. And if we want to know why it is that Protagoras is wrong, right? We want to know what knowledge is, and Protagoras did not offer an adequate definition. Well, Protagoras was giving speeches, and yet we just said Protagoras was wrong. He did not have knowledge of knowledge. So this is not sufficient. The second attempt is pretty interesting, and it's explained by Theaetetus, where he says, let's take up a wagon, for example, and he references Hesiod. So Hesiod says 100 pieces of wood belong to a wagon, which Theaetetus says, I wouldn't have the power to state, nor I suppose would you, but we'd be quite satisfied on being asked what a wagon is if we have the capacity to say wheels, axle, box, poles, crossbar. Right? So if I'm asked, what is Theaetetus? How do you know who Theaetetus is? And I say, well, Theaetetus is skin, hair, a brain, eyes, thoughts, feet, emotions, right? All those things which do seem to make up Theaetetus, because we can identify all these different attributes to Theaetetus. That is this account here of what exactly an articulation is, because I would be enumerating all the elements or the parts that make up the whole, which is which would be in this case be Theaetetus, or in the example Theaetetus specifically gives, the case of Hesiod with the wooden wagon and identifying all the things that make up the wagon. And this is actually a bit similar to later on in the semester, we'll see the argument from Buddhism, which tries to explain how it is that there actually are no essences. There are only parts to things. Now, this answer is deemed insufficient by Plato because one could simply arrange the letters of the name Theaetetus in the right order. Right? So I could, if asked, how do you know Theaetetus? And I just say, well, I know Theaetetus because the name, it has a T, an H, an E, an A. Well, it has 3 E's actually. An A, right? Actually 3 T's, a U, and an S. Well, I've just articulated all the elements that make that up, but that doesn't mean I know Theaetetus. We can think of, again, if we are taking a foreign language class, we might learn how to spell a name, but that doesn't mean I can tell you what that name signifies. I can't explain to you how it's used in a conversation. We're left with this question, right? If we simply think that an articulation is an enumeration of the elements of the object of knowledge, we're left asking, what are the principles which get us from the order of letters to names and which therefore articulate syllables, right? Which allow us to then go from simply pointing out all the elements or the letters that make up the name Theaetetus and explaining how it is that those letters make up the name such that it can be used in a conversation. It can be used to convey opinions and ultimately, right, true opinions. That's what we're trying to get at. A way to articulate how the ordering of these opinions occurs, right, of the elements that make it up. And if I can't give that account, then I am simply not possessive of knowledge. In the same case of with the lawyer example in the courtroom, if I am asked, well, how do you know this person is guilty? And I say, I don't know, I just know they are. Yes, I could be true in my opinion that they are guilty, but I can't explain to you how it is that they committed the crime that they're being charged with. I can't put those pieces together. The final attempt to understand logos says, okay, well, if we need to understand the process of ordering that is involved in this, then that means to give an articulation of X, whatever that may be, for example, Theaetetus, is to cite the feature wherein X, Theaetetus, differs from everything else or everything else of X's or Theaetetus' own kind. So it is having, as they say, some sign to say in what respect the thing in question differs from all things, why it is different. Because if I truly know Theaetetus, I should be able to identify, yes, well, I know this is Theaetetus, even though, remember, he's said to have a snub nose like Socrates. Well, Socrates also has a snub nose. And Theodorus said Theaetetus and Socrates look alike. But how do I know then if they both have these similar features on their face, which one is Theaetetus and which one is Socrates, right? I can be able to explain that extra quality which Theaetetus might have, which Socrates doesn't have. So by explaining then the difference from all things, and this is important, all things, because if I can explain how Theaetetus is different from 99.9 things in the world, well, what about that one other thing? Does that mean there's another Theaetetus as well? Simply because I'm not quite sure, like, I've never met that other person, and yet I can't discern how they might be different from Theaetetus. So it has to be every single thing that must be articulated and explained how it is different from the thing in question. Now that seems to make sense, because what this is doing, right, is acting as kind of the glue that then would hold together all the things in our thought, of which we are then trying to differentiate from one another by getting at the essence of the thing, its being, right? What makes Theaetetus who Theaetetus is. And of course, in good Socratic fashion, as we know, this too is untenable. There are actually 2 reasons why this answer is not sufficient for the question of what is knowledge. So the first one is that if knowledge of Theaetetus requires a mention of his differentness, right, how it is he's different from all things, well, so does true opinion about Theaetetus. If we are going to know what Theaetetus is, who Theaetetus is, we would need to be able to explain why then our opinion about who Theaetetus is true. To do that means we have to explain the difference between a true opinion and all things that are not true opinions, false opinions. And we already attempted to explain what a false opinion was when we took up the second definition of knowledge, and we failed. Now, the second reason why this is not sufficient is because to possess an account of Theaetetus' differentness requires having true opinion about Theaetetus' differentness, plus a true opinion about the differentness of all other things, which means we end in a regress. We would end up needing knowledge of knowledge. Or in other words, again, what it means to have an articulation. So, before we can ever have knowledge, we would have to know what knowledge is itself. And that means we would have to know every single thing in the world. And that, of course, is ridiculous. That's silly, as Socrates and Theaetetus acknowledge. So, knowledge is not true opinion with an articulation. So what is the point of going through these definitions of knowledge and not coming to any definition, ending in aporia at the end of this text? Now again, as I've already said, one thing about this is by reading between the lines, we see that simply thinking that we can talk about knowledge as if it exists as something static, right, definite, and devoid of any kind of process involving the soul, right? We've seen, reading between the lines here, implicitly they've acknowledged there is a process which is necessary of education. Of course, they didn't take that up. Why didn't they take that up? There is some argument that the point of this dialogue is to actually disprove at the time what was certain common conceptions of knowledge. Things that when people would be asked on the street, what do you think knowledge is, they would say based on empirical terms, as with the case of Protagoras. There is also a similarity here with this last taking up of knowledge being true opinion with an articulation, and this attempt at kind of trying to work out the atomic structure then of what this articulation would consist of. This is likened to, in 20th century analytic philosophy, Bertrand Russell's logical positivism and his atomistic conception of knowledge, which would say that we come to know things from our experience when we are able to piece together all the things that make up those distinct phenomena in our field of experience. Of course, Plato was not responding to that because that theory did not exist at the time. But the takeaway from this is that empiricist terms cannot simply be the basis for knowledge. That there is an inarticulable process of the soul. Right? There's a rational process of something which is not simply seen. It cannot be articulated out of perception alone. Now, perception can be involved in knowledge, but it is not the basis for knowledge. Now, if you were probably the person, Theaetetus, right, involved in this dialogue with Socrates, you'd probably be upset because there was a lot of time, a lot of intense discussion spent on this question of what is knowledge, and of course, no answer was given. So, what exactly does this mean? So, I want to read the concluding remarks here from 210b. So, Socrates asked Theaetetus, "Then are we still pregnant and in labor with anything about knowledge, dear fellow, or have we given birth to everything?" So, he's asking Theaetetus, right, because Socrates is supposed to be a midwife. Have we given birth to all the ideas which were inside of you, Theaetetus, right? Or is there anything else we should still search for? Is there another possible definition for knowledge you can give? Theaetetus says, yes, we have, by Zeus, and I at least have said more on account of you than what I used to have in myself. So, Socrates says, then our art of midwifery declares that all these things came into being as wind eggs and aren't worth rearing. Absolutely. Then, if you try to become pregnant with other things after these, Theaetetus, and you do come to be so, you'll be full of better things on account of the present examination. And if you're barren, you'll be less severe with those who are around you and gentler, being moderate and supposing that you know things you don't know. For that and nothing more is the only sort of thing my art has the power to do. And I don't know any of the things all the others do who are and have been great and wondrous men, but I and my mother have been allotted this midwifery as our portion from a god. She among women, and I among the young and well-born, and those, that is, that are beautiful. But now there's something I need to go and face in the courtyard of the king Archon in response to the indictment which Meletus has drawn up against me. But at dawn, Theodorus, let's meet here again. And of course, they do meet there again, and that's where the sophists and the statesmen are then based. So there are many references there to the Apology and the other dialogues where, of course, people get frustrated at Socrates because Socrates is making them look ridiculous because they claim to have knowledge of which then, when they try to articulate it, they're unable to do so, right? Every time it ends in aporia, an impasse. But what's very important is to understand that what Socrates said to Theaetetus is, now you know what it's like. So don't make fun of people, right? When they think they know something and it turns out they don't know it. The unexamined life is not worth living. So we shouldn't therefore think, though, that simply examining our lives in a critical manner is easy. It is difficult. And that is what Socrates is trying to get across to Theaetetus. So what I'd like for you to do is actually use what we've learned from the Theaetetus and critique the 6 definitions of knowledge that are provided by the Merriam-Webster dictionary. Is there any cases of these definitions which you think overcome the problems identified by Socrates and Theaetetus? Or can you say, one of these seems to succumb to the difficulty of saying that knowledge is perception, one of these other ones seems to succumb to the problem of claiming that knowledge is true opinion, and referencing, right, arguments they gave in the text into why then maybe these Merriam-Webster definitions of knowledge are insufficient.